Alright, and welcome to the third part of the Next Gen Hot Rod series. What we'll be doing here is, as you can see, I've selected the engine and hit everything else, is we're going to start detailing this engine. Right away, this is a really mammoth video. It's in total this took me about 6 hours to create this engine. I've sped this up by about 200%, and it's also the first high poly modeling we'll be doing. First thing you see me doing here is deleting one of the extra superchargers. I decided, I mentioned it a little bit in the previous video, that I don't really like the look of two superchargers. It looks like bunny ears. I don't want my car to look like that, so I'm just putting one on it, classic style. Deleted the other one, and now I'm just aligning it here. So anyway, why am I not doing a mid-poly for this engine? Well, thing is, this engine is so complex in terms of details that it's not possible to reuse anything from the high poly for the low poly, and vice versa. As you can see here, that was my reference, the image. That's the main image I'm going by. Why am I using that image? Because it's relatively high detail, and because I just like the look of it. I want something similar. So I'm gonna build most of this engine in symmetry mode. Why? Well, just because you save work. This thing is gonna be a lot of work to build, so if we can save some work here and there, then we ought to do that right away. So starting out with this big block in the center, and want to add some detail to that. Mostly I'm going by that image. The image isn't really optimal. It was pretty much the only clear, and clear is still relative, clear high resolution image I found of a big block Chevy engine on the internet. So I took it into Photoshop, changed the contrast a little bit, and I'm using that as my main reference. I also have other pictures of car engines that I'm using, but I'm mostly going by this one. I'm using 5 divisions here. Why? It's a V8 engine, so I need to have 4 divisions in the center of my engine for each of the 4 cylinders on each side of the thing. So anyway, here's a little detail. I'm building these little inset cube parts. Basically, I'm not really going to explain basic high poly, like why would I chamfer when I need to have hard edges and that sort of stuff. I'm just gonna go into the details that I think are important for people who know a bit of high poly but want to know some important tips for when creating something as detailed as this. So one thing I'm doing here is I'm just looking at the reference image, and I'm looking at the parts that look important to me and that I think I should also include in my engine. I'm not trying to build an exact replica of that image there. It would just be too much work, and the reference isn't good enough. I'm just trying to build something that looks cool and that looks interesting. So immediately at the front here, I'm gonna create this detail that extrudes from it. I'm gonna make it as a separate part, you know, especially when making something as difficult as this engine. It's a smart thing to split stuff up into separate parts as much as possible. I don't want to keep it attached together too much. So I'm extruding this because it's a more interesting shape, using snapping to align that there. As you can see, the modeling I'm doing here is not really that difficult. You'll see the image of the end result of the engine. It looks completely insane to a lot of people probably, but it isn't that difficult to create. The main thing you have to do is look at your reference, generalize shapes, and drop the stuff that would just be too much work and barely be noticeable. I mean, why would you want to put, I don't know, an hour of work into a detailed cylinder head when one that took 15 minutes will look just as good, and 99% of people won't notice the fact that it's simpler. What I'm doing here is I'm dividing that big n-gon into several quads. When I'm modeling high poly, it's important that I keep stuff in quads. I don't want to have these big ugly n-gons. N-gons being polygons with more than 3 with more than 4 vertices on each side. I'll use tries in this engine. You'll see it's not really that much of a problem if you know what you're doing, but you have to watch out using 5-sided and more. You can use 5-sided, but you have to know what you're doing, and especially on that side of the engine where everything is nice and tight. I don't want to have sloppy and GONS. So this is a little box thing at the side of the engine. I'm guessing it's some sort of electrical component. I don't know each component of this engine exactly what it does. I know the general shapes and what they're for. I'm thinking this is something like alternator or starting engine, not sure. So just creating a rough, simple shape for that. Nothing too complicated. Also, this part I'm keeping as a separate part and not attaching to the big symmetrized halves, because it is a unique part. It's only on one side, so I don't want to attach it to the two halves, so it gets copied to both sides. Also, from the beginning on, I'm immediately sure of the fact that when I'm going to build a low poly and unwrap this engine, both halves of the engine will share texture space, because I don't want to put too much work into all this crazy unwrapping and texture baking for this. I mean, it's a complex thing, so if you can save work and cut corners without losing quality, just do so. I mean, when you're creating these things for production, you have deadlines to stick to, so you can't afford to spend too much time on something that won't be worth it. So there we go, put a Turbosmooth on it. Yeah, so what I'm doing now is my Turbosmooth Modifier, I'm copying it and pasting it instanced on each of my components. It's very important to do this. Why? You can turn off all your smoothed objects with one click then. Just click the little light bulb next to the modifier, you can turn them all off. In other applications this is probably more difficult to do, but in Macs it's an easy way to work. You can see it's all still a little bit too sloppy and soft. I'm gonna harden things up. There you go, see? This is a little problem you have sometimes. When you inset something, it's gonna inset it to one half and not to the exact center of the object. Not much you can do about that. You just need to fix that yourself then. So what I'm doing here is selecting these parts, and why am I copying them as a separate object? Well, because I want to create the cotter pan at the bottom of the engine. Cotters are the big metal engine parts, and the pan is a sort of metal pan at the bottom that collects oil, and that can be opened to drain the oil. So it's a simple part that's on the bottom of every engine. Makes the bottom a bit more interesting to look at. I'm not really going by my reference here, just basing this on what I have seen before as car engines. Once again, as I've said, with technical parts, if you're not sure how something looks, look at reference. My examples here are a bit more advanced. I'm not using as much reference as people who are new to this sort of stuff would need, which are probably the sort of people watching this tutorial. But just don't be afraid to use reference if you feel that you're not ready to create this with little reference. You see, because I made that cotter pan at the bottom a separate part, I can easily change the edges a bit and don't have to worry about the edges continuing in the big engine part at the top. So there you go. I deleted the inside, I aligned the polygons, and we're good. Once again, here you see me doing some connects. I don't have to worry about consistency with the top part because it's separate. As I said, separate parts can make your life easier when doing subdivision modeling. Alright, time to harden this stuff up a little bit because it looks way too soft. You'll see that the main tool I'm using when doing highpoly modeling is the connect tool. The connect tool together with ring selections is what I'll be doing most of the time, and then just some move tool. Again, you can follow this tutorial in another application than 3D Studio Max. Things will be a little bit different, but I expect people following this tutorial to be of a reasonable 3D level already before they will actually have some advantage following this tutorial. So if you are an intermediate to advanced Maya user, you can definitely follow this tutorial along. I'm pretty sure Maya can do everything that I'm doing here in Max as well. Some things will be different, but it should be possible. So I'm going for the cylinder head here. Lots of little insets, extrudes, and chamfers just to make it interesting. I mean, I want the normals for this engine to look absolutely crazy. I want them to look totally stunning. So I'm just going all out on details. There we go. Move those around a little bit. and I'm moving those edges. Why? Well, because I want this engine part to have an interesting silhouette. You see, I'm not leaving it exactly flat. I'm having it, well, I'm giving it some slopes and everything, so it's going to look a lot better. Also, note that you can see the edges of the cylinder head are not running through the engine. Once again, the cylinder head is a separate part from the main block. Also, I'm referring to this part as a cylinder head. If you're not a gearhead, the top of the cylinders is covered by metal parts, which is the head of the cylinders, so this is referred to as the cylinder head. It covers the camshafts that operate the valves in the cylinders. What I'm doing here is I'm adding some well, I'm starting to add some parts where I can create holes for the for bolts that fasten the cylinder head to the body. Also note that that's the reason I added these 5 edges, well, 3 in the center, to divide the engine into 4 parts along its length. Just because there are 4 cylinders, that means in between each cylinder there will be a bolt. So that means 3 bolts, so it's divided into 4 cylinders. Also, you can see this right away, but in my reference there are also cutouts holes in the corners of the cylinder head for bolts. I'm specifically choosing not to model those. Why is that? Well, that is because those are a lot more difficult to model, and once again you'll barely notice that they aren't there. See, this is starting to look like something, right? I need to add some more chamfers there. Sometimes I use chamfer, and I'm going to say it right away, chamfer is something to be used with care. You should only use chamfer on completely consistent loops. You can't use chamfer on loops that split into poles of 3 or 5, because it's going to do weird things there. Chamfer should only be used in cases where you're absolutely sure that you have full control over it. Simplifying things a little bit here. See, I soften the outer edges of the cylinder head a little bit because you don't want to make everything too hard. When modeling sub D, it's important to think about your normals, and if you make your crease edges so hard that you won't even be able to see the crease anymore in the normals, then, well, you should soften them a little bit to make things more interesting. A little rounded part there, move those a little bit, and what turns out, I'm going to have to add some more geometry there. So selecting these, there we go, chamfer it, and that looks about right. There you go. See, we're getting our nice shapes of our engine block pretty nicely now. Looking back at my reference, I know the reference is going a little bit fast at this 200% speed, but as you can see here, sometimes I'm looking at it for quite a long while, just thinking at what I am going to create, how I'm going to handle things. I really hope that if there's one thing you remember from this video, it's that from this entire series, it's that reference is extremely important. These are these little bolts, little details at the bottom of the engine block. They should be interesting. I'm attaching them and then just duplicating them quickly. There we go, that's starting to look better already. You'll notice that the edges of those 4 inset squares at the bottom are pretty round. I'm doing that on purpose because I want it to look like it's made out of molded metal, so I'm leaving them a little bit soft. Maybe I'll harden them up a little bit later, but as for now I think it looks okay. We're gonna have to add some more detail here. Yeah, see, I think about here I am thinking about hardening up these edges. That needs to be hardened a little bit. There we go, that looks better. Some edges at the outer corners of the engine are a little bit too soft. I'm gonna have to change that too. Alright, so once again, trick that I've mentioned before, if you're creating something complex in sub D modeling, And it's just going to take way too much work to model everything as one part. Just make it separate. Just make separate parts, attach them together, and in your normals they'll easily give off the impression that everything was modeled as one part. I mean, sure, you can go hardcore and model everything like that, but I fail to see the point in that. You're just putting way too much time into something that's barely going to make a difference. So here I'm creating this little border part at the end. These are molded metal pieces, and there might be some shapes in there to reinforce the shape, which is probably what I'm making here. I'm just roughly going on this by the reference. So I'm using reference here, but just filling this in a little bit with what I think would look good. If you're not sure about that, then just try to replicate the reference or look for more reference. Adding creases for everything. I didn't add them at the end because I want it to be a little bit soft, and you can see I'm duplicating everything here so it sits nicely spaced apart as it should. And now I'm attaching these things, and there we go. The side of my engine looks a lot more interesting. Those open spaces in between those, what was it, 5-6 parts I created, those are going to be where the exhausts connect to the engine, and that's going to take a while before I get there. So I have more reference. It isn't all that good as what I'm creating now. I'm looking for how these exhausts would be connected. That red one was a good one. This one, Christmas tree ornament, might be interesting. Because of the angle that you're looking at that part, it's not really obvious what I have to do there. Just thinking what I should use. As you can see, I don't have that much engine reference here yet. You might see more popping up later in my reference folder. That's just because I look for more when I need it. I'm going to start creating the entire pulley assembly at the front of the engine. Yeah, maybe now's a good time to explain what this thing at the front is about. You see, this engine is all about rotating mechanical parts, and the actual engine is just as simple as explosive energy that creates an up and down movement is transformed into a rotational movement by the crankshaft, and this rotational movement is then used to power pretty much all the other systems in the car and in the engine. And so the crankshaft is situated behind this purple cylinder that I'm creating here. So the main rotation of the car's engine originates from this part. So the leading half of it, because this can just be nicely symmetrized. There you go, that's looking better already. And there's some lots of small crap around that part there at the front. You see, that front part is really extremely detailed and complex, and I'm just not going to waste my time trying to recreate this accurately. I'm just going to make my own simple version of it that will look just as good to pretty much anybody. Yeah, that's looking better already. Alright, so I'm going to start adding some detail here. Most of the time it'll just be little extruded parts that will contribute to a nice normal map at the front there. So once again, I'm creating this as a separate part. Some really simple modeling. Well, it's basically really a very crude and rough generalization, and sometimes even just fantasy of what I think I'm seeing in that part there. So make sure between round and squarish shapes. So that's what I'm doing. And always the connects. If you model neatly and simply with just quads and nice extrudes, then you shouldn't have Shouldn't have problems adding all these connects. You know, really, modeling something as complex as this engine is, if you have the right approach, most of the time it's just simpler than creating something like a car body or anything. It might look more complex, but really, technically, not that difficult. Looking at other engines too, and yeah, there's this hanging asymmetrical part. A lot of the engine is symmetrical, but not everything, so it's important to have some asymmetrical parts in there also. This one will be another one of those. It's going to make things a bit more difficult later on when I have to bake everything, but then again, I think it's worth it just so the engine doesn't look too, how do you say that, too fake. Because that's something you easily see with when people, I've seen it a few times, when people create a hot rod and they're not real gearheads. You can tell by the way they've detailed their engine that they missed a few details that make it seem less real. I mean, a lot of people will probably not even notice, but just the simple fact that they make an engine completely symmetrical, or that they've left out, I don't know, something as important as the carburetors or something, will look a bit more fake to somebody that at least knows a little bit about it. And also, just detail makes things more interesting, so why not just add it? And if you make it technically viable, then, well, show you that you've done your research, and it'll look all the more awesome. So a simple extruded shape here. You notice that I'm just using really simple tools here. The connect, the scale, the move, nothing that special. You should be able to do this in other applications if you know how to use them on a decent level. So that's for all the people asking to if this couldn't be a Cinema 4D or Maya tutorial or anything. It's about workflow, guys. You can follow along if you try. There we go, that's looking interesting as well. And one thing that's typical for these mechanical parts is that there are these cylinders at the outer edges that are used to bolt the parts together, and that's what I'm going to be creating here. And this part is going to go a long way. It's going to help me add a lot of detail. 6 sides, because these Allen bolts are 6-sided. See, I'm chamfering these so that the 6 sides stay hard and that I don't get a rounded cylinder. Insert that thing a little bit, and this is going to be a little bit tricky. Connect these parts so that I don't have any yucky end-gons in the center. And there, align it nicely to that round part. Move that up, do a little inset here so that gets rounded as well. Attach things together, make it gray, and now I'm just going to align them to the correct positions. Yeah, I'm going to make these copies because this one is going to be used to detail the front of the engine. In the actual engine, all those holes for the bolts to connect in and the outer casing for them, those are all molded as one part with the metal of the engine. I'm making them as separate parts. Once again, simplify things. Don't make it too hard on yourself to model these things, because in the end you're barely going to notice this, especially when you're working with normal maps. Spacing these things around a little bit. See, so I made this one part that's not too complex, and I'm just reusing the hell out of it to get a lot of mileage out of the details I just created. So attach all these, do the same thing here, attach all the parts that I just created, and there we go. That's starting to look interesting, right? Because you're getting this contrast between smaller and bigger shapes, which is what this engine is all about. High, low, and medium frequency detail, and you just want to recreate that. So now I'm selecting all these shapes and the bolts as well. Why am I doing that? Because I want to move them inside a little bit more. I'm still thinking about my normal maps, and it's going to be a little bit tricky to bake, but we'll see about that later. We'll talk all about that in later videos. Alright, we still have quite some detail to go. Looking through reference for things that I want to create. There were these, how do you say that, extruded lines on the front of the engine, which I suspect are oil canals, because this engine is lubricated and it's cooled. Might be a water canal also, and the oil has to flow around inside these big metal casing parts, and that's why there are these little canals in the engine, in which oil is pumped around to cool and lubricate the rest of the engine. So just really simple, I'm drawing a spline on top of that with AutoGrid and attaching it. That's all there is to it. You can see some of the detail that I sort of inspired myself on for this. Let me go, I'm going to add another part there. I don't want to have everything aligned too straight, so rotate things around to make it a bit more interesting. Round things off. And just immediately I'm adding the connects to harden the edges. And yeah, you don't always see what I'm doing here, because you can't tell if I'm hitting the delete key, but most of the time I delete the insides of the objects that I shove together, just so they don't mess up my smoothing. Doing a little inset here, laying that back to the center. Yeah, I'm extruding this part just because I want to make it a little bit more interesting there. See, all these small details, extrudes, insets, they're not that much work to do, but they can add a lot in the end if you do a lot of them. There we go. See, now I have this nice rounded cylinder in the center there. It breaks up that flat feeling that front part had all the time. Just makes it more interesting. Yeah, this video will mostly be focusing on the front and the sides of the engine. Second part will be about the top and the back. Need to move those edges closer a little bit. You see, I go back to my my smoothed part and to check if the smoothing is alright. So yeah, we're also going to do a little bit at the top. What we'll mostly be doing in the second video is the carburetors, but I will be creating the big supercharger tunnel at the top. So this is the base to which the supercharger is mounted to the engine. And I'm attaching that right away so we can continue working with two halves. Yeah, just checking out reference for what to do next, because I think this is one of the more difficult things. Oh well, for the moment I'm just leaving it at that. What I'm creating here is the ignition coil. Well, I'm not sure if it's the exact coil, but it's this part that distributes the spark from the ignition system to every cylinder. It's this interesting looking part. That's why I want to create it. I like the shape of it. It's a cylindrical part that has a sort of crown shape at the top with eight well, how do you say that, caps, and these 8 caps distribute the spark to every cylinder. You might have noticed it on my reference before. It's this black part, and I'm just modeling that right here. And interestingly enough, it was had 8 corners also, so I'm trying to keep that in there. There you go, that's the first part. Local coordinate system, so I can move it easily. It's easier to do it like this. There we go, delete the inside. Do a connect to harden things up. And a little bit of modeling here to give these things an interesting top. There we go. Alright, what I'm going to try to do now is I'm aligning the axis, the pivot point of that thing to the main blue part, and using an array, which is an interesting tool in Max, to duplicate things around a central pivot point. I'm not going to explain array here, it's an interesting way to do this. If you don't know how array works, plenty of easy tutorials on that. Okay, so how do we continue now? Right, I was working on the ignition system, so I'm going to create the spark plug caps at the top of the engine. These are small plastic parts, caps on top of the spark plugs, and well, if you don't know what a spark plug is, fuel and air go into the cylinder. This has to be ignited to explode. What does this? A spark plug is a small metal and porcelain part that creates an electrical spark, and this electrical spark ignites the fuel and air mixture. And these sparks, there's spark plugs, there's 1 per cylinder, and they are situated beneath these caps, and I'm just simply modeling that cap here. I think I need to align it a little bit better. And watch out for the coordinate system. I don't want them to be so high. There we go, in the center of the cylinder, and duplicate 3. That looks about right. I could attach those, but maybe I'm being a little bit silly here, but I'm keeping them separate so the colors aren't the same. You don't have to do that. You could just attach them to the body. Also, what another advantage is if you convert those spark plugs into low poly parts, and you've kept them as separate instances, you only have to unwrap one, and the other ones are unwrapped as well. Okay, an extra detail part here. Delete the inside. This is just another asymmetrical part that's on the front of the engine. I really have no clue what this exactly does, but it looked interesting, so we're creating it as well. Simple box shapes, but just because you're adding chamfers, you're smoothing them, you can get these nice shapes out of them. You could build an entire engine out of just interesting primitives, just so you realize that it's not all that difficult. Connect these, bridge. Yeah, there's this dog bone type of shape in between there. I like it, so I'm creating it. There we go. Insets on these. Extrude them in. There we go. Attach it to the main part. Paste the Turbosmooth on top of it, and there we go. Another part done. Starting to look more and more interesting, right? Alright, what's up next? Yeah, looking at these parts, I think they need to bulge in a little bit like that, just to break up too much straight shapes. I'm doing this type of thing. See, it makes it a little bit more interesting. So what's next on our list? let's see. Right, the top of the cylinder head has these how would I call these little ridges on them. I'm not sure why they're there. I think it's mostly decoration, and has these decorative lines on them, along with some text. And this text is mostly the engine size and the engine type. So there we go. Yeah, I'm trying to make these a little bit shorter. Why? Because I want some text in the center there. Lining this part. Yeah, see, that's the problem. When you try to use a line with Turbosmooth, it tries to snap to every single damn vertex of your Turbosmooth. So it's a little bit tricky to work like that. Okay, I'm attaching those parts. And pretty soon I'm going to try and put my text in there, just rotating my engine around to see if it looks okay. So now I know about this. I'm looking for a font, Hemi head. Hemi is the name of an engine, head is cylinder head, and 426. It's a font specifically derived from, I think it's from Dodge engine heads. And you see me installing the font here, and then right away you can use this font in 3D Studio Max, Hemi head 426. Just typed out Hemi. Yeah, it creates a spline. I don't want to see that ugly. Put an extrude on top of it. First I need to make it a little bit smaller. There we go. I probably need to type some more text to make it interesting. Scaling, I can do that. Oh yeah, what I'm doing here is something I explained in another one of my videos. You remember the bevel profile? If not, go watch that video. Bevel profile is interesting because you can determine exactly how you're going to bevel or extrude a part. Adding bevel profile, there we go. Goes a little bit wrong. I explained why this is. It's because your bevel profile part is too big for the base. It intersects. There we go. That's looking pretty good. Pushing it inside. Yeah, you can't delete the original bevel profile, so that stupid spline is gonna float around there all the time. You see me trying here, but it doesn't work. Alright, so the text is a little bit too short, so I'm gonna type some more. 540. Why 540? 540 cubic inches is the displacement of the engine. It's pretty much, I think it's one of the biggest muscle engines there are, so I think it suits my totally over the top extreme hot rod car. A Hemi 540 engine. So there you go, that's how you easily create text. Yeah, this one of course is mirrored. You need to mirror it back again over another axis to fix that. There we go. Hemi 540. That's gonna look sweet on the normal map. Okay, I saved my file here because I've been working for over an hour on this. Sometimes you get caught up in working on this because this was pretty fun to do, but don't forget to save. I had a few crashes during this project. You'll hear more about that later, but remember to save so you don't lose some cool work like this. Adding some more detail on the front because I think it still looks a little bit too bare there. Yeah, I'm creating some sort of, I'm not sure what it is, some sort of bolt on the front. Bolts with a small hollow center. I'm creating a few of those on the empty spots just to open them up a little bit. See, same deal as with the other bolts. One model and then just use the hell out of it to get the biggest mileage of your detail. There you go. Look at that. That front's starting to look pretty cool, right? And only a few simple models makes it interesting. Okay, we need to add some more detail to this electrical part here. I think it looks too bare, so we're going to add some more to it. I want to have these sort of ridges encasing it. And I want the edges to be rounded off really round. So that's why I'm doing the connect so far apart. Attach that part. And there you go, select those. Do an inset. Some details that make it a little bit more interesting. There we go. It looks better already. Well, looking at this engine, you see a ton more details I could do, but I'm just not getting lost in creating all these details because, after all, it's not about just this engine. Well, you could follow this tutorial by itself because this engine makes for some cool renders once it's done. But you don't want to lose yourself in all the details since you have an entire hot rod with everything connected to it still to finish. So don't forget about that. Okay, I think I'm planning to start building the supercharger here. To move this about a bit, I want to make sure it's high enough. There we go. Yeah, the supercharger is divided in a few of these ridges, and something like that. That moves back a little bit, and I'm keeping the number of ridges equal to the number of cylinders, just because that's more interesting. Yeah, there we go. The supercharger really has an interesting shape, so I'm trying to do the same thing there. There we go. Extrude by local normal, and that's the start of our supercharger. Same deal, delete the edges that you don't really need and align them back to your symmetry center. It's simple if you keep the center of your model at 0, so you can just center them with one click. There we go, look at that. That shape's really cool to look at. This was really fun to model. I mean, it's a really cool part to work on. I think one of the first real difficult models I did when I started out, I think 4 years ago, was a supercharger for a car. I didn't model my own cars back then, but I modified other people's cars, and one of the first things I did was model a supercharger for another car. It was fun to do. Okay, so these need to be chamfered as well. Not too much because I like how they look rounded. I think they're a little bit too skinny, those parts. So right away I can tell those are too skinny. I'm selecting them and using grow and the scale tool, I'm making them a lot fatter. There, that's a lot better. It's a big sturdy engine, so you want big sturdy shapes as well. So that connects down to the bottom. I'm not going to put too much thought and headache into how exactly this engine connects to the supercharger connects to the part at the bottom. Just gonna keep it at that. So you saw me duplicate that bolt part. Why? Because I can use it again for the supercharger. Look at that. This little piece of model probably got the most use of all parts in my engine. The supercharger bolts onto the body of the engine, and the bolt's a little bit different, so I'm just modeling it like that. There we go. Some small tweaks and I can start reusing this model. Look at that. Oh, I forgot to delete the bottom parts of these these models. There we go. Deleted. That's starting to look pretty cool already. But we still have quite far to go. So let's see what's next up. Yeah, the front of the supercharger, there's this box type of shape, and I'm gonna model that just to fill up that empty space there. See, not everything I'm creating has to have a reason per se, but many times it's just to fill up spaces and make them more interesting. There, that's starting to look good. These shapes I'm just creating off the top of my head of what I think would look cool. Chamfering things. It's a little trick I do. I turn on edge constraints. I move something all the way into the top and then move it back out so it follows the edge of the top more closely. Since the problem with Connect you can get is that it doesn't exactly follow the exact shape of one of the edges you're aligning it to, and you get uneven creases. So these parts, I'm not exactly sure what those are, but you see them a lot on superchargers. They're these little push rod type of things with springs on them. And I'm gonna create those as well, just because I think it looks interesting, fills up that space nicely. And you'll see me create a spring shape right away. Springs might seem really difficult to model, but there's a primitive you can use for it. There we go. Alright, helix is this primitive I'm talking about. See, I get this helix type of shape if I just increase the number of turns and fill with those numbers a little bit. I can get this cool spring to use in my model. It was extremely easy to create. The only downside is you have a little bit of trouble controlling the number of segments. It gets high pretty quickly. So attaching everything, and I had edge selection on, so I need to watch out for that. So there's two now. Attach, and there we go, parts attached. Time to start on the next part. Yeah, I want to fill up this gap in between there, so I'm just creating a simple box shape to fill up that part. You'll notice I'm really using lots of separate objects and sliding them into each other. That's because modeling things connected as one part is what costs me a lot more work when working with subdivision modeling. Sure, it's possible to do that, but you just spend a lot more time making everything connect nicely and making sure your wireframe works and flows nicely. So I try to avoid that. A little part in the center to break the symmetry there. Split it in the middle, of course, so I can attach it there. of course I need to use connects to harden the edges. Attach it, and it turns out it's not nicely centered, so I'm gonna have to do that manually. There we go. Okay. I'm just having a look at how it looks sitting in the car. Look at that. It's starting to look a lot better than what we had before. We took this simple box from a simple box shape to a more detailed engine, and well, in real time I've been working on this for about let's see, it should be about 2 hours or something. I think it's a little bit less, an hour 45 minutes. So here I'm creating the front part of the supercharger. It's a sort of ellipse type of shape. It's a bit stretched. Not exactly sure how. Yeah, it turns out my supercharger doesn't sit nicely in the center. There we go, fixed. Okay, so this is the front part, and you see it has lots of bolts around it, and there's this big pulley coming out of it. So we need to model the assembly to attach it to. There's quite a few insets and extrudes there, so we're going that way again. So I'm just doing several of these after each other, because I'm sure it's going to look nice. The part is asymmetrical, so I don't think I'm going to be able to. That's looking a little bit too flat and boring. I think I need to improve that a little bit. Oh, there we go. These bolts are going to make a difference. And these bolts I'm not making hexagonal, because those are round bolts. Well, actually the inside is hexagonal, but I'm not going to take the trouble of modeling that. Alright, and now all you do is duplicate them all along the edge of that part to add the detail we want. And it's faster if I mirror that entire part as a copy to the other side, and then just fill up the center. There we go. That didn't take so long. These stick out a little bit too much, so I have to move them in a little bit. Alright, so on this part is a little bit of a, I think it's a placeholder for now, for me to go by where the pulley will protrude from. I'm going to start detailing it right away. So yeah, that part looks okay. It's a bit hard to tell in the reference what it looks like exactly, but just gonna try and make my own thing out of it. Yeah, it looks like I'm gonna start by creating the pulley here. Need to align it. Why am I giving this so many sides? Well, I guess I should explain the workings of a supercharger for this. Basically, people have heard about turbos before, and turbos and superchargers are forced induction systems. They force the mixture of fuel and air into the cylinder to have a higher compression. Well, there's they compress them more together, so the engine can run, well, can produce more power in the end. That's how simply that system works. But there are two ways of compressing this mixture more. One is by using the exhaust fumes to power a spool that compresses this more. The other one is to use the crankshaft rotation to power a mechanical spool that sits in the supercharger housing we just created, and this mechanical spool compresses the mixture as well. But to power the spool at the top, you need to transfer the rotational movement from the engine at the bottom, from the crankshaft, back to the top of the supercharger, and that's why this big pulley system at the top is there. And since a pulley actually has to drive the part at the top, there we need to have teeth on the pulleys so that they actually, so the how would I call this, the belt doesn't slip over the pulleys, because the belt also actually has some this teethed inside surface, so it doesn't slip. If you've ever seen the drive system of a Harley Davidson, it works in the same way. It's also a rubber belt. Well, I'm not sure if it's rubber, that is driven with pulleys. What I'm doing here is I'm duplicating these splines. This might seem a little bit strange, but why are these splines here? Well, these splines are here for me to create the belt shape. Of course I'm going to use a spline for this. This is the simplest way to create this. And what I'm doing now is I drew these parts, and I'm going to weld them. I need to hide everything I'm not seeing here. There we go. Snap those together. Weld these parts. A little bit of trouble getting these attached, but there we go. Weld, and they have become one part. Yeah, you need to snap them exactly onto each other and then use the weld command to create one out of them. And now, more difficult to connect these parts together. I'm gonna have to create some extra points for that. For that I'll use the refine tool. I'm just adding these points in there and then using the weld command to attach them together, just like I did before. And you see they're all spaced apart along the view's z-axis, so I need to move them around. They're snapped now, so I can move them both at the same time. And there we go, there's our pulley shape. If you just turn the spline type to rectangular, then you can easily turn this into a belt type of shape. Turn it black, and that's it. Simplest way to create this type of thing. And I even have control over the pulley count after this. Yeah, they were still sitting outwards a little bit too much for my tastes. I still think the front of that supercharger housing is too empty and bare. I'm really gonna have to do something about that. Also, the reason you can bolt the front off is to take the these spiral type spools that are in there. You can take them out to maintenance them or just to replace them. That's the reason you can open that thing up. So I hope you don't mind that I didn't mention too much about how I modeled this this gear pulley type of thing, but it's just really simple modeling. So once again, I'm saving time by reusing a bolt from another part there, lining it, lining the pivot, and then again using my array tool to create 6 of these bolts. There we go. That looks nice. Tend to attach these just so I don't have too many objects around, because what slows Max down is not high poly counts, it's a big number of objects. I want to keep that down. Yeah, so here I decided I need to upscale that thing a little bit, which gives me some problems with my belt shape here. I'm gonna have to tweak it a little bit. That wasn't the smartest thing to do, but hey, we learn. Yeah, I decided I need to space these parts out a little bit better. That means I have to manually tweak them to follow the curve. Just try and get it right as good as possible by my own judgment. There we go, that looks okay. Right. There's a few more parts there for the belt system. I'm gonna have to create those as well. And this one over here, I mentioned that the bottom one drives the top one, and that the top one feeds more power back into the cylinders in the end. So it's a connected system. But this one at the edge here, well, I'm not exactly sure, but I think this one is just there to make sure that the belt doesn't hit any of the parts that are on the inside. On my reference, you could see this other cylinder type of thing in the center, and the belt would hit it if it was just connected straight. Also, this asymmetrical belt shape is way more interesting to look at than a symmetrical one that just goes from one pulley to the other. I like this triangular type of setup. You see, these cylindrical shapes, they are extremely easy to model if you use bevel. You can do an inset and an extrude at the same time or separately, so it's super fast to use this type of thing. The only reason I sometimes go for extrude or bevel by itself is because it might be faster if I don't want to do either one of those, since you have to set them to 0 to negate their effects. So I'm going to put some bolts on the inside there too. Well, I'm just going to put one bolt on it apparently. Yeah, since this is not a driven system, it's just a free rotating guiding part for the belt. There's no reason to put more bolts on it. There we go. That looks pretty good. And it turns out that the belt intersects with that bottom part a little bit there. I'm gonna have to change that soon. Yeah, saving my thing again. Very important. So now we hit 2 hours and 10 minutes in real time. Alright, so the connecting part. You'd wonder why is this spaced so far apart? Well, the simple reason the belt is spaced so far apart is because there's a lot of junk, ignition, whatever, camshaft belts and everything, camshaft chains beneath that, and the belt needs to sit far enough away from the body to not interfere with it. I'm just gonna try and make this thing as interesting as possible. So that means I'm using a few cylinders for that. Delete the sides you don't see. Okay. And rotate those around because I want to have these 4 cylinders and one in the center, just because it's going to look more interesting on the normals. And also, well, sort of the idea behind it also is this has to be a solid construction. It has to withstand some force from from a 1,000 horsepower engine, so you need things to be quite sturdy. There we go. Just adding some shapes to make it more interesting. Also remember, if you're working with cylinders, use the align tool a lot, since things have to be aligned nicely so you don't end up with a sloppy misaligned model. Yep. Yeah, okay, that looks okay. I'm gonna have to add some more detail to it. One of the things I've seen on other superchargers is there's this sort of protective part that sits on the outer edge, the part where it's most likely to have something hit or just touch and interfere with the belt. And yeah, they have this sort of segment that sits there, sort of shape I'm modeling here to protect that part of the belt and the drive system. So I'm just recreating that because I think it looks cool. Just an interesting shape to have on there as well. And you see it's quite simple to model, so too bad I can't really show you the reference or I'm not showing you the reference that I use for this. I think it's pretty cool. And I'd show it to you, but I'm creating this off the top of my head because I've seen it on other hot rods. I can't really remember where, but it's important to have an eye for this sort of details. If you think, oh, wow, this is an unusual part, yet it looks cool, then go ahead and use it. Yeah, here I need to harden the edges on the outside, and now the ones on the inside, because I want the inside to be nicely bent, but the outside has to be crease hard. There we go. And there. I really like how that looks. This asymmetrical shape. Asymmetry is really interesting to use in your model. So especially for this engine, because most of the car is completely symmetrical, save for the steering wheel. So I want to add some asymmetry in the engine to break things up. Yeah. I told you about this thing. We're gonna have to fix that. There we go. Just move them a little bit so it fits. We don't have the bottom drive wheel yet, and we also don't have that cylinder part in the center, which I was talking about. We don't want the belt to interfere with that. I'm not exactly sure what it is. It's not really obvious on my my reference, but I'm just going to create it since it's a really easy shape. It's basically a cylinder with a bevel on top and then some edges to add the hard creases. and an inset on the back. Don't forget about the parts at the back. If I were to delete that side, then you'd get an open edge there, and everything would be extremely hard in terms of creasing. But if I model it, even though you don't really see it, I'm going to get that nice rounding at the back there as well. So there we go. What more is there for me to create here? This part, I'm going to copy it. I'm going to create a duplicate of it. Take that all the way to the back, center the pivot so I don't have trouble moving it. Mirror it around and change the shape a little bit. See, this is just smart working. Reuse parts you've put effort in, so you don't have to create them again from scratch. I'm probably going to modify that a little bit. It's going to be in the next part of the video. But to start from, if it's a part that's similar in any way, just duplicate it. Same thing here. That pulley system thing at the bottom is quite equal to the one at the top, save for some modifications. So I'm just going to start off with the top one. Some selections and some scaling, and I've saved myself 5 to 10 minutes of modeling time again. There we go. This is all just on my imagination. I'm doing this to move it to the inside, and it's a little bit too big. There's probably a reason for this, that there's a size difference in the real ones also. Well, if they would put a size difference in there, that means there's a gearing. The one at the bottom will have to rotate slower or faster than the one at the top. But in this case, nobody is going to notice in a 3D model that there's a difference in size in the supercharger belt gears. So there we go, that looks about right. To move this a little bit so it's aligned correctly. Yup, and that looks right. Okay, we're pretty much nearing the end of this first part. You can see with none too hard modeling, we've managed to create a pretty interesting model. I'm just looking at it from all sides here, but I have to admit, this is starting to look pretty cool already. And in the next part, we'll be finishing this up by creating exhausts, a gearbox, carburetors, and the blower at the top. So we still have a lot of work to cut out for us. Look at that. Doesn't this look awesome in that hot rod? So hope to see you in the next video, and hope you learned something from this one.